Throughout life, we meet others who have insights and experiences quite unlike our own. The great ideas of classical works resonate differently with them. Often these treasures of mind and heart go unshared, reserved from others in the course of daily life. But what if we took the time to have those conversations, to sit down and recall those thoughts, those impressions upon us that moved us along our path? Why then, we would no longer be alone, and at least for one shimmering moment, someone else could see the world through our eyes. I give you the Confederal Reserve. Welcome to the Confederal Reserve, presented by BetterPears. I am your host, Dr. Jason Fugikawa. The Confederal Reserve is a show that connects old friends, that is, Confederates, to discuss the ideas and classical works that have shaped their lives and worldviews. Before we get going, I will invite you to like this episode, subscribe to the BetterPears channel if you have not already, and click on the bell icon to receive notifications so that you remain the first to know of future interviews and podcast episodes. If you'd like to support the work of BetterPears with your Federal Reserve notes and receive fractional gold in the mail each month, please follow the link in the description to our crowdfunding program, BetterPears Leaves. As a special bonus for the rest of 2024, every qualifying contribution earns an entry in our monthly Market Mug giveaway. Official rules are available at betterpears.com/giveaway. Now then, the structure of our show is our gimmick we want you to mimic. Our guest for the episode will offer a classical work of particular import to his or her life. What ensues is a conversation that uncovers insights and offers new perspectives on old works. It is a conversation between friends, which is the building block of the cultural renaissance that BetterPears seeks to foster. Our guest today is Ellen Toner. Ellen Toner is the Senior Editorial Manager for the Education and Programs Directorate at the Association of the United States Army, a nonprofit organization based in Arlington, Virginia, that supports soldiers and their families. She started as an entry-level editor there in 2012 after teaching a wide variety of humanities at a private prep school in New Hampshire for 3 years. She has a BA in Literature from the University of Dallas and is a 2015 graduate of the Denver Publishing Institute. Additionally, she has studied midwifery with the Midwives College of Utah and worked as a birth assistant and student midwife for a year. As time allows, she takes on writing and developmental and line editing work for Sophia Institute Press and Sophia Institute for Teachers. She lives with her husband and writer Jamie Toner, their children, and their fluctuating number of small farm animals, currently 15, on their half-acre farm in rural Massachusetts. It is my great pleasure to welcome our guest today on the Confederal Reserve, Ellen Toner. Welcome, Ellen.
Thank you very much, Jason. I'm very glad to be here.
Glad to have you on the show. And again, our gimmick we want you to mimic. Our question, our kickoff question, what is your vintage work and why is it so important?
The book that I chose to talk about today is Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey. And the reason it is so important is because in the work of novels, for one thing, Jane Austen is, of course, one of the greatest novelists of all time. It's indisputable. Let's not even argue about it. And the reason that I chose Northanger Abbey rather than one of her perhaps better known works such as Pride and Prejudice or Sense and Sensibility is that Northanger Abbey is unique in its approach to writing the novel because Jane Austen was very young while she was writing it, although it was published posthumously. People think that she probably wrote most of it when she was about 20 years old, maybe even her late teens. So it's very much a novel that is writing about writing. And, you know, one of the things that really the best writers do, that all writers do, but and you see it in writers like James Joyce and F. Scott Fitzgerald as well, when they start writing novels, they begin by critiquing, and not necessarily in like putting things down, but just looking very critically at what's happening in the world of literature around them and trying to figure out what their place is in it and how they relate to what's come before and what's happening right next to them, and just trying to define what makes sense in the world of literature. And Jane Austen is doing all of that in Northanger Abbey, and in a particularly funny way because she's really, it's a satirical parody of romantic Gothic novels. You know, swooning women and dark corners and creaky floorboards, and they were very popular novels in her day and age, and she's really making fun of all of them. And we have our own version of that in this day and age with the Twilight Saga, which I'm proud to say I've never read a word of. But people have been romanticizing vampires and their like for centuries, and Jane Austen rightfully put them in their place. So it's a lot of fun.
So you're telling me that paranormal young adult fiction is not a new genre?
Not a bit. And I should say I have never actually read Dracula. So, and I know that there are many people who have great taste in literature who think very highly of it. So my critique does not extend to Dracula.
Okay, very good. You have escaped the ire of the guest who's going to come on and talk about Dracula.
Okay, good.
And then write some epistolatory novelette or whatever afterwards after the interview. It was always my critique of Dracula. Like, these people are writing a lot of things down. I do not think there would be a written record of these events. And yet you have so Northanger Abbey. Maybe you could, for those who maybe haven't read it, as it is maybe one of her less popular works, what's sort of the main sort of thrust or gist of the plot that helps
Sure.
help kind of anchor people into the work?
Sure. So a little background. One of the things that's interesting about Jane Austen is that she was very well educated for her time. She had 5 brothers who were variously sailors and clergymen. Her father was a clergyman and a schoolmaster. They were all very well read. She was part of that. She knew what was going on in the world because her brothers were involved in the wars. They were involved in the politics of the time. She knew what the grand scale looked like. But she chose instead to focus on just very ordinary things that she knew directly, things that she experienced every day. And so the book is about this young woman, Catherine Morland, who is a clergyman's daughter. And well, she doesn't have, I think she probably has more than 5 brothers. She's one of 10 children. And her parents are good, ordinary people who are not very imaginative and not very dramatic. There's no hysterics like you get from Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. They're not evil. They don't lock their daughters up or, submit them to harsh punishments of any kind. They're just normal, ordinary people. And Catherine Morland is a normal, ordinary girl who's not very accomplished and not very pretty and not very bright. And the story is about her. There are some wealthy neighbors who decide to take her with them to Bath, which is where English aristocracy would go to spend the summers and enjoy the season and be sociable and everything. So she goes with this wealthy couple. She falls in love with the first man she meets, and eventually she marries him. And, there's some twists and turns along the way. But it's just very, there's not much going on. What is actually happening is that she is figuring out what it means to be a person. And she's learning, she's a young girl who's obsessed with Gothic romantic novels, and she's learning to distinguish between reality and fiction. And she's sort of set up between these 2 sets of siblings. She and her brother are both in Bath, and there's one set of siblings, John and Isabella Thorpe, and another set of siblings, Eleanor and Henry Tilney. And John and Isabella Thorpe are very dramatic, very sort of crass almost, very hyperbolic. They throw emotions around very freely, and they're not very sincere people. They're very utilitarian. They use people and play on people's emotions. And she first falls in with them and thinks that Isabella is going to be her best and greatest friend because she's the first friend she's ever made. She's never been away from home before. She lives in a small village. And so here's another young woman who's just like her, she thinks. And then she meets, she had initially met Henry Tilney, and then he left town and came back. And then she meets him again with his sister Eleanor. And these are people who are kind and steady and reasonable and have a lot of natural virtue. So it's about her learning to distinguish between vice and virtue and finding her place in the world and sort of maturing as she learns how to detach herself from the one and align herself with the other. And in the midst of all of that, she is initially very guided by the impressions that have been made on her through the novels that she's reading, novels which Isabella Thorpe is also very fond of. So Isabella Thorpe wants to be one of those heroines, which is why she's always doing everything in hyperbole and drama. So that's what the novel's about.
No, I mean, one of the things that interests me about the plot, I'm again very Aristotelian, and for Aristotle, it's all about plot and the actions and the motivations exhibited through the actions. It seems that on the one hand, in this sort of Regency period, and I believe it maybe earlier in the book, before kind of the crassness of the Thorpes come out, there's a concern for propriety, right?
Yes.
And so Catherine just doesn't go to Bath for her her debutante kind of whatever season, but she's taken there by these family friends, and then has to navigate the social mores, navigate the prospect of finding a husband. I mean, I don't think she's necessarily there to like take in the spas, right? I mean, they go to shows or whatever and that kind of thing. But she's kind of maybe it's unsaid, but like she's on a mission. And yet, at the very time in which she's in this structured society, she doesn't have her family, her parents necessarily, to guide her. And so I think there's a resonance, particularly in kind of the tumult that occurs in like every Jane Austen novel. We're like, oh, we misunderstood each other, and and you were good, but I thought you were bad, and these people were bad, and I thought they were good. That's how I do it with sock puppets. That's how I explain plots for Jane Austen novels. But that. It resonates, I think, with modern audiences in the sense that oftentimes young people will go away to college, right, and leave the familial structures that have been sort of the bumpers in their life that keep them, the guardrails that keep them from straying too far, and so here you have a novel where that is the case, whereas something in like Pride and Prejudice, she does like go to her sisters, right, or her aunt and uncle. But there's still kind of, I think, a presence of people helping to direct it, whereas family friends, they seem to be more laissez-faire in their approach.
The man that she's with, it's the Allens, Mr. and Mrs. Allen, that she travels with, and the man is he has his head screwed on straight, and he does actually correct her and guide her a little bit in who she spends time with and about not driving out in carriages with young men unaccompanied and things like that. But he's a little behind the eight ball. He corrects it after the fact instead of before. And the woman, unlike her own mother, is not very sensible. Her overriding concern is with her clothing and whether or not her dress is getting torn or frayed or whatever it might be. So you're right about that. And it's funny that you compared it to going off to college for the first time, because as I was rereading the book in preparation for our conversation, I was remembering in Brideshead Revisited, one of the things that one of the main characters that Charles Ryder realizes after he's gone to Oxford and initially made all of these friends, and then in his later years at Oxford is sort of retreating from all of that. I don't remember if it's Ryder who says it himself or if it's just the narrator speaking. It says that you tend to spend your last 3 years at university trying to shake off the unwelcome friends you made in your first year. And it's very much the position that Catherine finds herself in. And she enters into this great intimacy with her friend, with this young woman, Isabella Thorpe, and she turns out to not be her friend at all and to just be using her. And it takes her a little time to realize that. But she does. She does.
Very good. I was wondering if you could talk maybe a little bit about where you would see kind of the satire of the Gothic novel kind of drawn out in this novel. You said she's critiquing or commenting on literature of her day.
Yes.
What was so dissatisfying? I would say wrong with literature, right? What was so dissatisfying that Austen is trying to contribute in a more fruitful way or in a more authentic way to what she believes or perceives her audience, or at least just herself as an audience, desires in a work?
Sure. I think that because the scenes can be so overwrought in the Gothic novels, and I confess I have not read this one, but the one that she refers to most frequently is The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe. And my older brother has actually read that book, which I'm very impressed with. But it's on my to-do list. It has been for 20 years. What she's critiquing there is that they're not realistic. And I think that real development and real growth and real virtue is obscured and lost and doesn't have time to blossom and flower when everything is so overwrought all the time. There's, like I said, she wrote about the things that she knew directly. She wrote about human character and virtue and nature in the very ordinary things that she saw happening around her every day. So I think that that's probably why she was critical of that approach. She probably just saw it as a little bit silly and not very helpful. And I am by no means a philosopher, but I do know one thing that Alistair McIntyre said about Jane Austen. He admires her and notes that she was one of the last, if not the last, great novelist to write in a world where Christian virtue was taken for granted instead of thrown out and undermined. She writes in a world where the standard that's expected and that people are measured against is one of Christian virtue and all of, moderation and temperance and humility and courage and chastity, quite frankly. So that's something that is not well reflected in the romance novels. And she's not preachy about it, though. She's very funny about it. It's when Catherine Morland is invited to go stay with the Tilneys. It's called Northanger Abbey because their home used to be an abbey. Dissolution of the monasteries.
Right.
We're not fans of that, but it led to some great settings for Austen novels. So she goes back to this abbey that's owned by the Tilneys. And as she's writing there, Henry Tilney, who knows that she's very fond of novels and also actually has read a great deal of novels himself, sort of plays up some ideas in her mind. She's like, oh, it's going to be this beautiful building with like secret passageways and interesting mysteries to discover. And he says, you might like walk into a room and find a cupboard that's full of little doors and nooks and crannies and open it in the middle of the night and find a secret manuscript that's been hidden away for centuries. And the room that the guest room that she's brought to, there is just such a cupboard as he described. And so she's sort of watching it out of the corner of her eye and waiting to get around to it. And after dinner and after everyone's gone to bed and the house is quiet and she's just got the one candle, she goes and she like starts opening all the cupboards and everything. And in a drawer that's hidden behind two doors, or, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you get the idea. She does actually find this ancient sheaf of papers. And she doesn't want to build up the fire because, quite frankly, she doesn't quite admit it to herself, but it's spookier when the fire is dying down, right? And then she tries to snuff the candle because lower the flame a little bit because she doesn't want anybody to know that she's up and digging around in things that are really none of her business. And she accidentally puts the candle out. And so now she's left in darkness with this mystery sheaf of papers, and she's completely worked herself up into this emotional state. She's terrified. She jumps into bed and hides into the covers. And in the morning, she sees the papers there on the floor, and she runs to discover what it is with the early morning light. And it's a laundry list. It's like cravats, shirts, jackets, waistcoats, whatever it is. And she's totally mortified because she realizes that she's let herself get worked up into this whole state. And unfortunately, although she reprimands herself harshly and tells herself she needs to get a grip, basically, this is just a precursor of a much worse offense in which she imagines that Henry's father killed Henry's mother, and sort of brings this to Henry as maybe your father was not actually very fond of your mother, and maybe that's why she died. And he's like, what is wrong with you that you could possibly imagine that would happen? And it's true. Henry's father is not a very nice man. He's actually a pretty terrible person, but he didn't kill his wife. He didn't sink to that level. So that's part of Catherine's maturation, is her realizing how fevered her imagination had become because of the novels, and how real life isn't actually like that, and how you need to make a distinction between the two, or you end up hurting the people around you and being a real idiot. So, yeah.
No, and that's an interesting path of self maturation or development, where kind of the catalyst for sort of the defect in Catherine is this sort of external thing, these Gothic romances, and not some interplay with other characters, right? And so it's I don't know. It seems a little bit more abstract than perhaps in Emma, where it has to deal with how she's behaving towards classes that are lower to her, and not recognizing kind of the weight of her status in society, and then it's like a social amends that is required. For Catherine here, it seems that you need to rein that in, lady.
Yeah, and it's certainly encouraged by the people around her. But it's an excellent point that you make, that the novel as such is almost a character in this book, and that's part of what makes it so interesting, is that the writing about novels is so key to the development of the plot. And Isabella Thorpe is sort of a vehicle for that. As much as the book has a villainess, she is it. But yeah.
And in a way, right, remind me, you with the literature degree, I mean, the novel is called the novel because it's new, right?
Yes.
And sort of the newness of the novel has to deal with, I think, that it can involve sort of main characters that you follow closely who are not all that important, right?
Yeah.
It's not an epic. It's not, it's not the Song of Roland. A novel can be about regular people. And
yes, it can be.
So how would you define a novel? I guess would be where I want to push that.
Oh, goodness. Well, just some basic form. A novel is not written in poetic verse. It's not structured like a sonnet would be. It's a lot freer in form, although it does need to have an overarching plot, a conflict and a resolution. It needs to have a protagonist and antagonist. The conflict of any novel, there are four main conflicts that happen. Any real novel, you can look at it and identify the conflict as one of four primary conflicts. It's either man versus man, man versus himself, man versus God, or man versus nature. So that's how you break down the tussle of any novel. And it starts with setting up what is the conflict and watching that conflict. I'm trying to do this backwards for the screen here. It grows like that, right? And then it comes to the conflict where everything is totally chaotic and you don't know what's going to happen, and then it resolves very quickly. That's it's the long, slow rise and the quick denouement, which is the resolution at the end.
So for all the Lord of the Rings fans out there, not a novel. The denouement of Lord of the Rings is like 150 pages.
Is
get on with it.
That's how I felt about All the Light You Cannot See. It was part of the problem is that I was listening to that book rather than reading it, and I kept expecting it to be the ending, and it kept not ending. It had like 6 endings. I was just like, okay, get on with it already. But anyway, that's a tangent.
Okay. No, because it is, I think in Austen's time, it's a relatively new art form.
Yes.
And kind of had risen to prominence. And I think the world was still sort of struggling with what to do with that.
Yeah. And I mean, relatively, Don Quixote is considered the first novel, and I think that was 1500s, if I'm remembering correctly. So Yeah, 250 years. But you're right, that is relatively new.
I think in millennia.
Yeah.
He's like, "Yeah, there's this new thing on the block.
Yeah.
America, new.
Yeah. Which actually it's easy to remember, speaking of America, it's easy to remember when Jane Austen was born. She was born in 1775. So just before the American Revolution. So there's none of her siblings were old enough to fight in the war, but certainly that age of revolution and political unrest and conflict shaped her worldview.
Very good. Trying to think of where to go next with this. Does what do you think draws kind of modern readers? Because I know in various sort of young adult circles tend to be circles with women. You know, Jane Austen is the bee's knees, right? What is her draw? What excites? Whether in Northanger Abbey or her literary corpus as a whole, what do you think kind of captures the imagination of young people today? Because she's the greatest novelist, apparently, that we're not even going to discuss, even though you already mentioned Don Quixote.
It's true, I did. I don't know that I would say she is the greatest novelist, to be honest. I do think that she is indisputably one of the greats, but I don't know if I can say who the greatest novelist is. I will say we named our first daughter after a Dostoevsky character, so there you go. But there are a number of things that I think are attractive about the world she writes in. One I've touched on before is that she understands people so well. She, for one thing, although her language might seem formal and hard to get through to our modern ears, she's very precise. There is not a word that is unused. Every word is carefully chosen, and it was actually her sister Cassandra was her editor, and she's very meticulous. So entering into a world where everything is distinct and ordered and matters, nothing is wasted. That's not, I wish that were the actual world we lived in. But she is able to distill the world we lived in down to its barest parts and help us to recognize and to order things, because she did write in an ordered universe. She wrote in that Christian universe. And that is also, I think, one of the things that people who love Jane Austen today are missing. You know, we live in a post-Christian society, and nobody, nobody's happy about that, whether or not they claim to be. We know that there's a natural order and a virtue and a rightness about that way of life and about that construct, and about how it allows men and women to relate to each other and find their place in society and be good parents and good siblings and good children and good spouses, and how it allows you to find a good spouse and to recognize what that means. And so I do think that just it's beautiful, it's purposeful, it's ordered, it's rhythmic, it makes sense. And we live in a world that is, and you know, every age of this world has had its chaos and its disorder and its vices. I don't want to romanticize Jane Austen any more than she wanted to romanticize her contemporaries. But we do live in a post-Christian world, and I think that the beauty and the order of Christianity, whether or not they know what it is or what to call it, I think that's a lot of what people are looking for. And there's this great line I think it's in The Importance of Being Earnest. It might be an Ideal Husband. I get the two of them confused sometimes. I know. It's The Importance of Being Earnest, right? Okay. So the older governess, sort of teacher figure of one of the young women has this wonderful line. She says, "Well, the good ended happily and the bad ended unhappily. That is what fiction is." And it's what reality should be, and it's sadly not always the case, but Jane Austen usually manages to make it be the case. And she doesn't She doesn't turn somersaults to make it happen or pull rabbits out of hats like Dickens does. I don't think Dickens is the greatest novelist. But, she even does this thing in Northanger Abbey where Eleanor Tilney, the leading man's sister, ends up engaged at the end of the novel. And she says, and now, dear reader, because it's not actually okay to introduce a new character at the end of a novel and not have introduced him in any way or given him any role earlier in the novel, I will tell you that he was in such and such a scene in this, and he was watching this conversation earlier in the book, or something to that effect. And it's hysterical because she breaks that wall, which is highly unusual. Not just, there are many authors who will say, and now, dear reader, but she actually talks about what she's doing with the plot and the structure and brings you in on that conversation. And what Dickens would do, he would just tie everything up in a pretty bow and everybody would be related and everybody would have a wealthy uncle to leave them an inheritance and everything would make sense at the end. But she actually acknowledges that you have to have a reason behind all of that. And so while she's pulling it out of the hat with one hand, she's also going back and sort of editing it with the other hand, not actually, but just in your mind, so that she's not breaking the rules that she is setting up, that she could break if she wanted to, but she's that's not what real novelists do. If you want to be a real novelist, you need to actually have things set up. So here we are, and I'm going to go back and say that I set this up earlier.
No, but I do think that is like a Cervantes throwback too.
Yes.
He's all about referring to the first book, right?
Yes. Yes, he does.
And critiquing how things drug on in that first book, and in a way that I think the world is better off that we have pithy or kind of witty ways that the narrator can now be a character, opposed to just simply this sort of omniscient reality, this conceit to the storytelling. The storyteller can be a part in this.
Yes, and Jane Austen, she very much inserts herself into this in a way that she doesn't do in her later novels, which is part of why people think that this is the first one that she really got serious about writing. Her father very much encouraged her in her writing and gave her notebooks when she was maybe as young as 10, I think, some of which are still in existence. And this collection of little stories and scenes that she sketched out is called her Juvenilia. And there's a 1999 production of Mansfield Park where it's starring Frances O'Connor. They take Jane Austen's Juvenilia and they weave it into that story. They make Fanny Price, who's the main character, have this backstory that actually she's a writer too. And they take Jane Austen's own writings and so if you want a quick introduction to her Juvenilia and the sort of outrageous and overwrought and very comical way that she would write as a young woman and as an adolescent, that's a good introduction to it. But a lot of that flavor is especially strongly present in the first half of Northanger Abbey. And there's some theory that maybe she wrote the first half of it when she was a teenager and came back and wrote the second half of it later, because it does sort of shift in tone and become a lot more serious. But also, I think that there's room to argue that it's shifting in tone and becoming more serious because Catherine Morland is becoming more serious and maturing. For the record, it's kind of an abomination that they do that in the Mansfield Park production. Nobody understands Fanny Price talk about a virtuous woman. People think that virtue is boring, so they tried to make her more interesting by giving her this whole other dimension to her character that didn't exist in Austen's novel because nobody understands her. But anyway.
No, but I think maybe my last kind of question for you would be, you talked, you brought up virtue. You mentioned the Tilsdales, the Tilneys
Yes.
are kind of naturally virtuous, which is kind of like the oddity of their situation in the sense of like their father, not so virtuous, right?
Yeah.
And maybe you could graph it onto their late mother, who was kind of that sign of where that comes from. But is there something in Austen, in Northanger Abbey, kind of playing on this question of sort of natural virtue or cultivated virtue, cultivated vice, natural vice, where the characters, while Catherine might have a moral kind of movement in her soul from kind of the frivolity of the novels that are kind of working her up, it doesn't seem like the other characters do. That they're kind of fixed, right? Is that something characteristic of Austen?
It's interesting you ask that, because I have always liked Henry Tilney in some ways more than Mr. Darcy from Pride and Prejudice, more than, oh my goodness, Emma, Mr. Knightley from Emma, because Mr. Knightley is kind of preachy, and Mr. Darcy is kind of stuck up and quiet. And Henry Tilney he talks easily, he's just pleasant, he's a nice guy to be around. But on this recent read through, I realized he's kind of flat, he's a little bit boring. And Mr. Tilney and Mr. Darcy are much more interesting characters. And I do think that some of this comes back to Jane Austen being a young writer as she's introducing him, and just sort of like, okay, and now the young woman who's in training to be a heroine, that's what she says about Catherine Morland, that nobody, in fact, hold on, I know I'm going off a little bit here. The first line of the novel is that, where is it? No one who had ever seen Catherine Morland in her infancy would have supposed her to be born an heroine. So there's this, this idea of her being very ordinary, but also, right from the start that she's the heroine of the novel. And Henry Tilney just sort of seems to serve a purpose instead of being a character, if that makes sense. He's like, okay, here's the heroine out at her first ball in Bath, and now she needs to meet a young man. So here's a nice young man for her to meet that's pretty colorless and pretty bland. And in terms of development for virtue, you're right that Catherine is pretty much the only one you see. She and her brother too, actually, because her brother had actually been very much in love with Isabella Thorpe and had been engaged to marry her, and then realized that she was not a good woman and broke off that engagement. But most of the rest of the characters are either good or bad, but don't have a lot of dimension to them. Yeah, and Henry and Eleanor do have a brother who is also not a good man. And he's unfortunately the reason that Isabella and Catherine's brother broke up, because he got involved there and made a little love triangle and did things with Isabella he should not have done. So he very much takes after his father. The other two take after their virtuous and wronged mother. But yeah, Catherine's the main character. It's a short and simple novel. And so Jane Austen wasn't, I think, trying to do too many complicated things with it.
No, and I think that is part of its kind of allure as a novel, right? That its scope is not a grand epic, and here's how all the brothers K are gonna come to realize who they are in relation to their crazy father and have their own little moments. One daughter, she's our focus, and then everything else is largely focused on her, right? And I appreciate that in Austen, where in her later novels, where you have a Knightley or a Darcy who are doing things and concerned behind the scenes, and so it's not kind of in front of the main protagonist, Emma or
Lizzie.
But there's you get the sense that Jane Austen knows what's happening. She understands the propriety and what a virtuous man would do, and how he would think and comport himself, and then doesn't have to write about it, but that the audience can kind of fill in what was going on in the background while the protagonist was extrapolating in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and even the proposal scene at the end where they get engaged, she doesn't write it. She just is like, and now, dear reader, all of the right things were said, and I'll leave it to your imagination. It's like, what?
She yada yada the best part.
Yeah. Um, so yeah, she's very, that's what, like I said earlier, that's one of the things I like about her is that she's very spare in her writing. There's every word counts and she doesn't waste time. She sets out to do something and she accomplishes it and doesn't get distracted along the way.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Well, thank you for sharing your insights into Northanger Abbey with us
of
today.
course.
I want to give you some time to share some of your projects with our audience and to let them know how they can follow your work.
Okay. So as Jason said, I am the senior editorial manager at the Association of the United States Army. And one of the things that we are doing there right now is supporting this initiative for soldiers across the Army called the Harding Project, which is reinvigorating writing and scholarship among soldiers. We're in an interwar period right now, as we were in the 1930s. And Harding was an officer who revitalized the infantry journal in that decade. And his work helped soldiers to become critical thinkers again and to love reading and writing again. And over the past 20 years of conflict, reading and writing is not something that has received a lot of focus in the ranks or even in leadership where it should. So if you want to look up the work of the Harding Project, you can follow the Substack. There are articles published there twice a week. And that's something that I'm helping to do through my work with the Association of the U.S. Army. I'm working with the two soldiers who are in the office of the Chief of Staff of the Army to figure out better ways to educate soldiers and to help them love reading and writing and editing. Okay, and then on the other side of things, I do work for Sophia Institute Press nights and weekends, and there are two great books that I got to edit over the last year. One is Restoring the Lord's Day, How Reclaiming Sunday Can Revive Our Human Nature. That is by Daniel Fitzpatrick, who is also a University of Dallas graduate, although we did not overlap at all. And that's a really interesting book because you just, you see the title and you think, okay, yeah, we need to keep Sundays holy. We need to figure out how to do that. But it's about a lot more than that. He writes about how sloth is really the overriding vice of the modern era, and that sloth is not synonymous with laziness, that really what it means is a discontent with whatever is right in front of us and a seeking after whatever we've left behind or whatever is coming next. So it steals our inability to just be where we are and to be at peace with where we are. And that's why we're a country and a society and a world who's forgotten how to rest and who doesn't know how to just be at peace on a Sunday. And he also links it back a lot to the liturgy and how order and beauty in the liturgy. And he doesn't compare Novus Ordo with traditional Latin Mass. He just talks about liturgy in general. When the music is right and the atmosphere is solemn and the prayers are rich, that wellspring of grace is really what feeds our ability to be at peace. If we can bring ourselves to be present there, it will dispel sloth in the rest of our lives. So that was a wonderful book to help edit and give structural advice on. Another really great one was by a German priest, Father Ralph Wyman, who was a scholar who focused specifically on the works of Pope Benedict XVI. And his book is on sacramentals, their meaning and spiritual use. And that's a great area of interest because we live in a world that's full of superstition. So when we look at these special items and practices and customs in Christian tradition, Catholic tradition, that are instruments of grace, it is easy to dismiss them as superstitions. Right now this cross that I'm wearing, it's a scapular medal, it's a miraculous medal, it's a St. Benedict's medal. It's got everything going on for it. And it's had all of the right blessings from the old Rituale Romanum. So it's a very wonderful medal to be able to wear. And Father Weiman, he's so ordered. He's just this tidy, rational, clean German thinker. And he's written this wonderful book about why all of these things make sense, what the history is behind them, what the theology is behind them, and why they're not superstitious, why they're actually real instruments of grace. And the foreword is by Cardinal Robert Seurat. So some good work there. Other upcoming work, my husband has his newest novel coming out with Prism Press, which is a relatively new imprint of Whitefire Publishing. The Fight, it's a fantasy novel. He likes writing fantasy. I'm working on a book for Sophia Institute for Teachers. That's an introductory guide to the traditional Latin Mass. That will be coming out in probably November or December, shooting for Advent. And it's a collection of scholars who are writing that book together. And my sister and I have written 3 of the 10 chapters for it, and I'm sort of doing some finishing touches to the rest of it. So that's a lot of fun. Let's see. I post intermittent updates on our backyard farming venture at Backyard Edit on Instagram. And then, of course, our most important work is our children, all of whom have very long and complicated names, reflective of great saints and great literary characters. So we're expecting our 4th baby on St. Patrick's Day, which is why I'm wearing C-bands, because I'm in the first trimester. I feel fantastic.
That's very excited, and thank you again for coming to be on the show.
Of course.
As I'm very excited to have you on here today. And so, yes, thank you again for being our guest today. It's a pleasure having you on the show. To our audience, from all of us here at the Confederal Reserve and the BetterPears Cultural Empire, thank you for watching. See you next time on the Confederal Reserve. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. You can click here to watch a recent interview of the Confederal Reserve, or over here to view the playlist of the BetterPears podcast.